Okay, so this chapter is all about segmentation. Now, what exactly is segmentation? From my view, segmentation is just splitting business entities up. It could be customers. We split them up into high valued customers, low valued customers, customers who purchase frequently, customers who don't purchase frequently. But pretty much any business entity can actually be segmented. Let's go back to our Honda in Europe case. Here we will actually segmenting cars based on the breadth of their product range and their brand image in Europe. So we had the Honda, Daewoo and Hyundai who were low on both, and at the other end we had these mid-market companies who had this like very high breadth of product. So usually if I'm actually teaching this all in class, I would kind of challenge the class to give me something to segment. But what I will do is I'll give you kind of almost a product segmentation, a retail segmentation, where here we're segmenting stores. And then I'll look a little bit at customer segmentation. So let's just imagine we have all these kind of fashion stores. And we're going to segment them on price, and we're going to segment them on kind of trendiness or youth appeal. Now, these guys here, trendiness and price, these are what we call segmentation bases. This is what we actually segment on. And the idea when we do technical segmentation is I can do visual segmentation in 2 dimensions, but I might have 100 pieces of information about the products. I might have 100 pieces of information about a consumer. So we tend to use statistical software, and software in particular, for example, called cluster analysis, to actually do the segmentation for us. But, this is not an analytics class. This is an international marketing class. So we're going to kind of stick with very simple examples. So kind of low price, but quite trendy. We've got our fast fashion. So we have Forever 21. Maybe H&M's not quite as trendy, but we'll put there. We have our traditional stores that are not trendy at all. Maybe Macy's is a bit more up here. But we have JCPenney here. Then we have our kind of mid-range, mid-sized, small to mid-sized stores. We've got Banana Republic. And we've got Anthropology. And then let's just say we've got slightly more higher end, our almost defunct Nordstrom. And something kind of maybe Louis Vuitton. Something kind of high end there. And we might try and group them into groups of similar stores. So Forever 21 and H&M are similar. This is kind of our traditional, slightly struggling department stores. Then we've got our mid-range here. And we've got our high end there. So that's a simple product segmentation for you. Now let's do one more before I go to the slide. Let's do a customer one. Let's get a black pen. And let's just have students. So we'll segment students on 2 segmentation spaces. Time studying. And time partying. And imagine we just got thousands of students, so I can't draw like a dot for every single student, but I'll just kind of split this into 4 groups of students. And, we've got lots of kind of students in each segment. I'll just draw lots of little dots to assume each one of these is a student. And imagine that we're selling like some hangover cure energy drink. And our phrase is for those people who burn the candle at both ends. This would be, you know, probably my most high value segment. And, you know, this would be my lowest value segment. So a bit of a silly example, but I think it nicely illustrates what exactly segmentation is. So let's kind of go back a little bit to the book material. And the book talks about segments needing to have certain different properties. Now, before I do this, I'll just say I usually set some multiple choice questions on this. And I usually end up having to allow multiple answers to each of these questions because it's quite hard to differentiate these. So identifiable means we should be able to identify and measure our variables. You know, it's very easy to segment somebody by the amount of income they have. It's very easy to segment somebody by age. It's a little harder to segment people on beliefs. You know, you could do a survey and work out how politically liberal to conservative somebody is on a scale of 1 to 100. You know, how much somebody values the environment. Now, the book doesn't seem to like those sort of kind of psychological indicators, but they are used a lot in marketing. So on the whole, segments just need to have at least some variables which you can use to actually identify the segments. You can't just have, you can't do segmentation unless you have segmentation bases. Let's put it this way. And I think some of the stuff that we've talked a little bit about before, so I'm not going to talk about it again. If we're doing this internationally, we have to be wary that some of our segmentation bases may differ across different countries. For example, we had the example last week of Latin American countries sometimes kind of having higher scores on these strongly dislike to strongly like kind of scales in questionnaires. Segment should be big enough to go for, and that's kind of almost a given, you know. With flexible manufacturing, we can target slightly smaller segments. But, you know, imagine if I'm a cell phone company, you've got kind of a trade-off. I could produce thousands of different phones, each aiming at this like really, really tiny micro segment, or I could have one phone that is for all my consumers. So it's kind of a trade-off. But imagine if I'm developing, you know, a medical treatment for a disease that's maybe got 10 or 20 people who have the disease, then that segment may not be actually viable. And in cases like that, it may be that I have enough people all over the world for my segment. So considering my segment to be worldwide might make it slightly more viable. Okay, so the segment should be relatively accessible. This could be a physical thing. For example, you know, we talked about in the case this week about how the majority of consumers in kind of sub-Saharan Africa don't have bank accounts. So if we wanted to develop banking services for this segment, then this segment is not particularly accessible. I'll give another example, and this was kind of alcoholic lemonade. And this is going back quite a while, but when I was a teenager, and these drinks companies started selling alcoholic lemonade. And there was the thought that this was actually deliberately aimed at younger teenagers, even though they couldn't say it was. So this is an example of a company might want to aim at this market of teenagers who want to drink alcoholic lemonade, but it's kind of going to be illegal to explicitly target them. So that segment is not particularly accessible. And the segment should be responsive. So going back to my little example here, if I do a promotion for this energy drink, and I would expect, maybe 5 times as many people in this segment respond positively than in this segment. If there's no difference in responses to my promotion, then on what I expect to be really low and what I expect to be really high, then my segmentation is probably useless. So my segment needs to be responsive. Okay, and sometimes it's not always a good thing. It's sometimes good to have a growing segment, but if I want to target a certain segment, it's a good thing that the segment is relatively stable over time. It makes it much easier to target the consumers. But say, for example, if I have a new product, say, for example, a new type of online gaming, the fact that this segment is growing might be a good thing, but it just makes it slightly harder to target consumers. And the segment should be actionable. So say, for example, I've got a segment of rural males earning less than $30,000 in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. That's relatively actionable. I can make a plan to reach that segment. And again, higher income urban females, metropolitan areas, earning more than $100,000. But if I have a computer algorithm that spits out, something like this, earns less than $10,000 or greater than $30,000, and living in 4 or 5 random states, that's not actionable. Another example of not actionable is my alcoholic lemonade segment. It's both probably not accessible and also not actionable, because taking action on that segment, might get us in a lot of trouble. So we have, and I might actually assign this as one of the articles in class. We have a nice little article from the New York Times on micro-segmentation. And this is the fact that there's a company, and this was when this article was written, it was called Blue Kai, but it's been absorbed into, there's a big company, originally a database company called Oracle, and they have something called the Database Cloud. And it literally has, all your credit card transactions, what you've searched for online, what you've bought on holiday. It basically has everything about you gathered from lots of different sources. And based on that information, which is actually quite scary, we can put consumers into these very small, what we call micro segments, and target these very micro segments with specific adverts. So we have 2 segments here. We have our segment of gay married Scotch drinkers and our segment of vegetarian comic book collectors. So these are just some and our segment of maybe married karaoke lovers. So we have these kind of quite specific consumer segments based on a lot of things, based on lifestyle, based on orientation, based on consumer habits, and we can begin to target actually smaller and smaller segments. So that's just the idea. That's just something, a little bit of an aside that I thought was actually quite interesting. Okay, so next we're going to talk a little bit about, I've talked about segmentation in general. We're going to talk about segmentation in an international marketing context. And I'm also in that, I'm going to add a little bit about general geography and geographic segmentation. So we're going to start off talking a little bit about the use of segmentation for country screening and marketing research. Then we're going to talk a little bit about market entry and positioning strategy. And then eventually we'll talk a little bit about marketing mix and different positioning that we can have in different markets, aiming for kind of different segments. So firstly, country screening, very, very simple. Try and find, we'll maybe map the countries a little bit like you did in homework 2, and we find a very similar country to our existing market. So we could look at, for example, let's go with our Buffalo Wild Wings example. We could look for a culture with, similar values of the Hofstede measure, like individualism. We could look with a country with the same language, like English. We could look at a country with a similar GDP level of economic development. The idea is, if we're moving from a certain market into a new market, it's much easier if we move into a similar market. It's generally easier to move from the US to Canada than it would be to move from the US to Japan or China. Of course, it's not completely the same as we found out with Target. You can still kind of get messed up, but that's kind of one way of looking at country screening. You know, we could look at cultural similarity. We could also maybe look at things like, you know, the GDP per capita. For Buffalo Wild Wings, we could look at the number of people who drink alcohol. We could look at things like inflation. And once we've kind of segmented our countries, we could actually look inside the country. You know, is the middle class in this country big enough to support our product? It might be, for example, that India has very low GDP per capita, but, you know, there's over 1 billion people in India. If there's a segment of middle class who can afford our product of 200 to 300 million people, then that's kind of a huge, huge market. Another reason for segmenting countries is for marketing research. Doing marketing research is expensive, as we talked about last week. You know, we can't do marketing research in every single country in the world for a new product. But maybe we will find some culturally similar countries via segmentation, and then and we'd maybe split the world into 5 or 6 segments and do marketing research, you know, in the most representative country out of each of those different 6 segments. One thing I wanted to talk a little bit about more than the book is geographical segmentation, because I think that's kind of very important. So this is like a little map of income in the Paris metro area. So it shows kind of the wealthy areas in central Paris. Then it's got some of the poorer areas in the middle and then the outskirts. This is what in Paris is known as maybe the banlieue or the suburbs, which tend to be the poorer places of French cities. And you know, if I'm a retailer, you know, where would I put my store? If I'm a high-end store, I'd probably want to put my store in one of these central districts. But, you know, if I'm the French equivalent of Walmart, I may want in one of these more lower middle class districts, because that's where most of my customers are. And I'll give you another nice little example of geographic segmentation. And this is interesting because this is something I actually did years ago. And there's a commercial segmentation solution called Tapestry. And I think I accidentally created a backdoor to it. But let's just, this is through something called GIS software, which is Geographical Information Systems, which is all about showing information on top of maps. So let's just have a look at this. And we'll ignore, I did a load of random stuff. The idea of what I did here is I was adding information on Yelp reviews to a map to show you could do different things in the map. So, and I might actually add this to the homework, having a look at different places. So what we're going to actually do is, what this solution does is it actually gives you a map and looks at an area and then kind of characterizes the different segments, the different consumer segments in that particular area. So let's have a look at Starkville and Oktibbeha. Okay, so I think this is the Starkville area. And let's just have a look. The segment here, the predominant segment is college towns. And what we get is we have a little bit of, it's college town, the people in the college towns, tells us a little about it, the median age, people focused on education, enrolled in college and graduate school, 1 in 7 lives in the dorm, and it tells a little bit about your preferences. Because apparently you guys like living at McDonald's, eating at McDonald's, Wendy's, and pizza outlets during the week. And I live near the Wendy's in town, and looking at the queue at the Wendy's, then that's certainly true. And you could maybe look at some other areas. So let's just go, and I guess there's a few of you from, let me just think. Let's just have a look at Birmingham. And let's just have a look at like the Mountain Brook area. And this is the Boombergs. Okay, I was trying to get Mountain Brook. Yeah, let's just have a look at this Boomberg segment. And these are additions to suburbs, busy, affluent, young families. I think I might have got Hoover by mistake. I'm not sure. And again, it tells you a little bit about their preferences and their consumer preferences. And this is very basic segmentation solution. There's, bigger paid ones where they'll tell you exactly how much of each consumer segment is in a certain area. Okay. So let's just move on a little bit, and we'll think a little bit about the market and market entry. So here's an example, and this is, similar to my kind of college example, but this is actually based on countries. So we're segmenting countries here, both based on their per capita consumption of coffee and how much a certain kind of in-home soluble coffee accounts for total coffee consumption. So imagine we're Folgers or Nescafe, and we're trying to work out our markets. And we're trying to work out how much the market is actually worth to us. And, we can split our markets up into these 4 segments. And maybe, we're in a bit of a recession at the time, and we're in trouble. We may, for example, want to remove ourselves from some of these developing challenger markets where we don't have a good market position and it's not a very strong market for our product. This segment here, it's a strong market, but we're not very strong. We may wish to improve our brand positioning, our market. This segment, we want to actually maybe think about how do we hold our position. And in this segment, we're the leader in the market, but it's not that profitable market. But maybe as the leader, we could actually help expand that market. The example I give is drive-through restaurants. When drive-through restaurants first came to developing nations in Asia, nobody understood the concept of a drive-through restaurant. So McDonald's, who was the leader at the time, did a lot of advertising on, how to utilize a drive-through restaurant. What is a drive-through restaurant? Okay, so market entry decisions. And I said it's a little bit like I described before. Your product's successful in one country, you move on to a next country. And you want to kind of segment your countries based on certain characteristics relevant to your product. We're always going to have general characteristics, economic characteristics, what we talked about in chapter 2, for example, competitiveness and corruption and things like that. But certain products we might actually want to segment on certain consumer characteristics. So if we had Tabasco sauce, we might want to maybe segment countries on, how hot people's taste palates are. In the UK, we used to have quite bland taste palates, but now in the UK, we eat a lot of spicy food, we eat a lot of Indian food, a lot of Thai food, so our taste palate has changed. So again, that's an interesting segmentation basis for Tabasco sauce. Talking a little bit about positioning, and this is my example here. This is Cathay Pacific. This is Hong Kong's major airline. Now, Cathay Pacific was well known as I've flown on Cathay Pacific business class. It was well known as a luxury kind of business class global airline, taking business people within major cities. But after September the 11th, and also due to the 2008 recession, this segment got a little bit smaller. And so Cathay Pacific struggled. So you see they rebranded themselves as kind of Asia's world city. They branded themselves very much as an Asian airline. And then focused on getting high-income consumers in the Asian area to start traveling by Cathay Pacific. So they changed their positioning a little bit in order because of differing marketing conditions. Okay, so we'll just finish there, and then the next video we'll talk about segmentation approach.